Hi guys. So as promised, here are the lectures that we missed due to the electoral vote and then the Thanksgiving break. I hope you've all had a nice break and we're back in full learning mode. So if you remember, we were on lecture 3. We've already covered this, but I just thought we'd sort of, get you back in the mood. The point of the third lecture was to demonstrate how various consumer behavior areas, our perception, our learning and memory, motivation, emotions and affect, our attitude formation and change, our personality, our culture, our decision making, each of these would typically be a chapter in a regular consumer behavior course. And the goal of this lecture is to demonstrate how we can Darwinize, how we can incorporate evolutionary theory within each of these uh, functional areas. And I think we did all this, and then we went through all of the senses, and we had left off, I think, at the last uh, sense here, taste. And so now we're moving on from the perceptual system to learning. So, of course, there are different ways by which consumers learn. There is what's called the behaviorist school of learning. This is where you are arguing that learning happens through an association between a stimulus and a response. So classical and operant conditioning would be examples of this type of learning. Classical conditioning is Pavlovian conditioning, right? The dog doesn't need to be conditioned about how he should react to the smell and sight of food. That's an unconditioned response. It's an instinctual response. But then, on the other hand, the conditioned response is that every time you give him the food, you ring a bell, so that eventually, after doing it enough times, the dog will learn that there's an association between the food and the bell, and so that eventually, once the conditioning has taken place, simply ringing the bell will cause the dog to salivate. Operant conditioning, which is also called Skinnerian conditioning after B.F. Skinner, is where you propose that the way that organisms learn is by a, an association between an action that you take and a consequence. If a pigeon pecks at this lever, uh, X number of times, it will receive a food pellet. But if it doesn't do that, it will receive a zap, electric zap. So in the context of consumer behavior, classical conditioning would be, for example, to link a schema that we already have about cowboys. So we already know that cowboys are supposed to be rugged and virile and risk-taking. That's something that's already in us. Well, now if I'm Marlboro, I want to associate that schema to Marlboro, and so through repetition, I will hopefully get you to learn the association between virility and risk-taking and frontier, rebellious schema associated with the cowboy. You're going to associate that with my brand. Operant conditioning, for example, frequent flyer miles is an example of operant conditioning. If you're loyal to us X number of times, you'll be rewarded accordingly. So these types of learning processes are particularly important for low involvement situations, right? This is not how you learn how to do well in this course, right? In that case, you need higher order learning, which is known as cognitive learning. Vicarious learning is when you learn by watching the behavior of others, or observational learning, or uh, modeling behavior. And of course, we also use reason. Humans have reasoning capacity. So, for example, if I want to learn the 17 reasons why I should buy your mutual funds, I'm not going to learn that through operant conditioning. I'm not going to learn that through classical conditioning. I actually need to, uh, commit some cognitive resources to that learning process. Now, the next one is a bit of a mouthful. So the latter learning theories are domain general and context independent. On the other hand, evolutionary psychologists view the human mind as consisting of domain specific, context dependent computational systems. What does that mean? If you remember, domain specificity basically means that the human mind has evolved to solve specific evolutionary problems, right? Remember the Swiss Army knife metaphor. Different knives in the Swiss Army knife are used for different purposes? Well, these types of, for example, if you look at classical conditioning, it could be used to explain how we make an association between cowboys and Marlboro, or it could be used to draw, explain how how a dog learns to salivate at the, sight, at the sound of a bell. In other words, they're domain general mechanisms that can transcend different contexts. Well, what evolutionary psychologists argue is that sure, that's true, but we also have to take into account that organisms have evolved a penchant to learn certain things better than other things, precisely because our memory system is an adaptive mechanism. In other words, for example, the dog is more likely to learn through classical conditioning through his nose than through his sight, precisely because olfaction is more dominant for the dog than his sight. So the idea basically is that according from an evolutionary perspective, one must recognize the biological preparedness of a given species to learn particular stimuli more so than others, and to do so via the use of one sense more than to do so with another. This insight was demonstrated originally by Garcia and his colleagues in the 1960s with conditioning of rats via their taste buds. So again, yes, we learn through these domain general mechanisms, but we also have these domain specific mechanisms that explain why, for example, the squirrel is able to learn and memorize where it stores foods in your backyard. So its memory system has evolved to solve a very specific adaptive problem because it is a squirrel, and therefore its memory system and its ability to learn might be different than that of humans. So on the next slide, I exactly address this issue. So if we want to study memory, how do people in general and how do consumers learn information that is eventually stored in their memory? Here what I've done is I've gone through great pains to come up with different studies that demonstrate how our memory has really evolved to solve specific evolutionary problems relevant to humans. So here's one great study. So cheaters' faces and names are more likely to be recalled than those who are not cheaters. So if I give you an array of photos of people, I control for how good looking they are and so on. And below each of the faces, I either tag you as a cheater or not. Now you might say, well, what do you mean by cheater? For example, a cheater in a social interaction. If I do something for you, are you likely to reciprocate or not? If you never do, then you're a social cheat in that sense. Well, it turns out that our memory system is very much attuned to learning this very important information about people. I want to be able to remember who I could trust or whom I can trust versus those that should be avoided because they're going to cheat me. And therefore, the faces and the names of those who've been tagged as cheaters is more likely to be recalled. So this shows you that our memory is not this domain general mechanism. On the contrary, our memory is specifically attuned to be more or less likely to remember information that is evolutionarily relevant. And this is actually quite a profound point to make, because it basically argues that the difficulty or the ease with which consumers will learn certain information is very much dependent on, if you like, the evolutionary relevance of that information. So just to give you another example, this is an example in social settings. This is for the survival module, food. So there's greater spatial recall of high-calorie foods by women, and then there's other research that shows that it's true for both sexes. What does that mean? So if I showed you a map, say a map of a food store or a food market, and then asked you to remember in that map where different foods are located, you end up recalling much more the location of high-calorie foods. You understand what I mean? So it's not that you have equal probability of remembering all food sources. No, to the contrary, your memory is biased to remember, in this case, evolutionary relevant information. Higher the calorie, the more likely I am to remember its location. Not unlike, in that sense, how the squirrel has evolved the ability to memorize and remember where it has stored various food caches as the looming cold winter approaches. Adolescents are better able to recall survival relevant information regarding fruit. So if I give you a fruit and then list you 10 attributes of that fruit, some of those attributes might be very survival related, others are not. So for example, it might be, well, this fruit, you should not eat it unless it's at least 5 days ripe. Otherwise, it exudes a toxin. There is such a fruit in Jamaica. Well, this basically shows that if I gave you 10 pieces of information on a fruit, you're not equally likely to remember the 10 attribute information. Instead, you're much more likely to remember that which has survival implications. This is kind of similar to the food one here, but related to beautiful faces. Both men and women are more likely to remember. If I show you a matrix made, full of faces, and then I ask you to remember where do you think certain faces were in that matrix, both men and women are much more likely to have spatial memory recall of women's beautiful faces. In other words, both men and women have adaptive penchant to remember where beautiful women are located, but for different reasons. Of course, men, it's so that because men are attuned to women's beautiful faces for intersexual, mating, whereas in the case of women, it's intrasexual rivalry. Here's the next one. Men's greater likelihood of recalling status products after being primed with a photo of a beautiful woman in sexy attire. So priming basically refers to putting you in a mindset, right? So I could, for example, prime you by showing you a photo of a sexy person. So I'm putting you in a mating prime. Or I could prime you by showing you whatever, some neutral, natural landscapes. Well, it turns out that men, once they've been primed to be in a mating mindset because they've been shown a photo of a beautiful woman wearing sexy attire, and then you show them a bunch of products, they're much more likely to recall status products after being primed to be in a mating mindset. In other words, their attentional bias and their memory bias to status products, which of course are related to mating, right? We use status products, certainly men do, as a sexual signal to appeal to women. So their likelihood of remembering status products increases if they are in a mating mindset. Again, look at all of these incredible studies, none of which would have been possible to explore were you not coming from an evolutionary lens. Now, this next one is also amazing. Women are much more likely to recall status product when they are in the ovulatory phase of their menstrual cycles. Remember, when a woman is in the ovulatory phase of her menstrual cycle, this is when she can conceive, she can fall pregnant if she engages in mating, and therefore this is when she might be most attuned to mating related cues, in this case status products. So again, her ability to recall products waxes and wanes across the menstrual cycle, specifically as relating, in this case, to mating related products. And then finally, the survival processing effect basically says if I give you, say, 30 objects and I ask you to remember them, but in one case I tell you that these products are going to be used in some survival scenario, and in another case in some non-survival scenario. This is going to help you survive in the savannah versus this is going to help you move somewhere, or whatever the case is. Simply priming you, putting you in a survival frame of mind, causes people to recall better. In other words, your ability to recall information simply increases by putting you in a survival mindset. Ostensibly, that must be because you're paying more attention, you're more cognitively committed, more emotionally committed. So again, all of these findings, all of which are either directly or indirectly relevant to consumer behavior, you would have never thought of these, let alone uncovered them, where you're not coming from an evolutionary perspective. Now, when people learn information, typically they have to be exposed to it a certain number of times. But it turns out, as you might imagine, that repetition, or what's called the classic inverted U of repetition effects, is this inverted shape. In other words, up to a certain point, repeating a message is good, but then after that, it becomes a bad thing, which is contrary, by the way, to the classic economic idea that more is always better. No, consumers get bored, consumers suffer from information overload. And so the argument is, how can we try to explain why this inverted shape exists? Well, the gentleman who proposed this theory, his name is Berlyne, Berlyne. I think he was housed, I think he's dead now, but he was housed at University of Toronto, proposed something called the two-factor theory, which basically says that whenever we are being exposed to a repetitive message, say, an advertising campaign where you're repeating an ad, you are really exposed to, or you are under the influence of two factors, hence two-factor theory. On the one hand, you have this curve, the positive learning curve. Each time I see the message, I learn a bit more from it, therefore I feel better towards it, but it reaches an asymptote, right? It reaches a plateau. So in other words, if you watch this lecture multiple times, each time you watch it, you might learn something new because maybe your mind had wandered the first time you watched it. But if you watch it enough times, there won't be a single syllable that you could extract more from having seen it for the 300th time. So it increases, but then it reaches this asymptote. On the other hand, there's an opposing force called negative tedium, which is basically a fancy word for boredom, that increases at an increasing rate. So think, for example, of a funny ad. A funny ad, or a surprisingly funny ad. It's really surprising and funny the first time. It's less so the second time, and maybe the fifth time it's quite annoying. So if you take this factor and amalgamate them, you get this inverted U shape. Of course, what advertisers want to know is, where is this inflection point? How many times do I need to show the same ad before it starts going downhill? Okay? And of course, the answer is it depends. It depends on many things. Now, I did a set of studies a few years ago. Well, now it's almost 20 years ago, I guess. And regrettably, we never ended up publishing them, but I'm still hopeful that at some point we will publish these studies. This was some stuff that I had done with one of my former doctoral committee members, Doug Stamen, where we wanted to look at something called sequencing in advertising. And you'll see in a second how it relates to the previous slide. So suppose I've got enough money to have 9 ads repeated, right? So just if you count this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I could repeat an ad 9 times. And I have 3 different executions of the ad. What does that mean? A different execution of the ad is, you change something about the ad. It could be either a cosmetic change or a substantive change. Think about the bunny rabbit batteries, the Duracell or whatever it is. So the bunny rabbit can be shown, going off in the highway, and he goes on forever. He could be shown going off in the Sahara Desert, and he's going on forever, meaning that the batteries are very durable. And so these are different executions. The general theme of the ad remains the same, but you change the execution. And so if you've got 9 repetitions with 3 executions, you're still left with an important decision. Should you show the same execution 3 times, meaning 1, 1, 1, then switch to 2, 2, 2, then switch to 3, 3, 3? We introduced this new variable, which we call string length. So the fact that here you see the same thing 3 times, and then the next thing 3 times, and then the next thing 3 times. Whereas here, the string length is 1. It's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Well, if you were to ask economists here, after you see this whole string, this whole sequence, and then this whole sequence, you ask classical economists, what should be the final evaluation here? They would tell you, well, it should make no difference, right? The order of information should not have an effect on your overall evaluation because you're seeing the same information, whether you see this sequence or that sequence. And of course, as is often the case, economists are perfectly incorrect. Order does matter. Okay, and so what we wanted to do was study what is it that can help us predict when this sequence is better than this sequence. And we argued that complexity of the message in the ad determines that. If you have a complex message, then you need to see the same ad many times before you move on. In other words, if we go back to the previous slide, if you have a complex message, it takes longer to fully habituate and reach that asymptote. It takes longer of seeing the same ad before you get bored of it. On the other hand, if you have a simple ad, then I see it once, I already know everything I need to know about the ad. Then I'd like to, the only way that I can keep from being bored, the only way I can keep from, the negative tedium is to constantly introduce change. So for simple messages, this was the better sequence. For complex messages, this was the better sequence. And this was, by the way, a set of studies that not only we had a lot of success with scientifically in presenting them at academic conferences, but also many advertising firms were, top firms were very interested in this work, precisely because this is a very real life problem. How do I sequence my ads when I have a fixed budget? So there you go. Now moving on to something completely different. Remember, I'm covering all these different areas in consumer behavior and showing you how we can Darwinize them. So now I'm moving to motivation. Well, the classic theory of motivation that is studied in consumer behavior is still Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The idea being that there are these different needs that we have to meet: physiological, safety, belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization. And there are all sorts of great advertising slogans that cater to each of these five hierarchies of needs. Now, why is it hierarchical? Because Maslow argued that you have to have the first level met before you move on to the second level, before you move on to the third level. And regrettably, he was wrong. And in the inner cities, you might have very poor kids who have hardly any calories in their bellies. They're starving to death, and yet they're willing to spend their every last dime on getting the latest cool running shoes. So it isn't true that it's all hierarchical. But also the second thing that's somewhat wrong with Maslow's theory is that he didn't necessarily link all of these, needs to specific evolutionary and biological goals. He was a humanist psychologist, so he thought that this is how humans ought to behave if they're going to be maximally fulfilled, maximally enlightened, and therefore our ultimate goal should all be to seek self-actualization. Well, that's all good and well, but if you walk on Crescent Street to study consumer behaviors on a Friday night, very few people are navigating the self-actualization level. In other words, it makes a lot more sense to tie our motivational system not to some utopian view of how humans and consumers ought to behave, but rather to understand why we do truly the things that we do. And hence, this is why I talk about my 4 Darwinian modules. So instead of Maslow's 5 hierarchies of needs, I talk instead about survival, mating, kin selection, and reciprocity. Moving on to affect. Affect is different from effect, right? The A and the E are there for a reason. Don't mix them up. Affect is basically your state, your feelings, your emotions. So there's a lot of great research that's been done in consumer behavior looking at how emotions affect things. But I should start by mentioning this. Our moods can both be antecedents or they can be outcome measures. So let's look at both. Mood as an antecedent would be, I put you in a good mood or I put you in a bad mood, and then I see how that affects your ability to remember ads. So in this case, mood is an antecedent. You're either in mood A or mood B, and how does that affect some subsequent behavior? Of course, in other cases, mood is the outcome measure. I show you a fear-based ad versus an ad that has rational appeals, and then I check how that affects your emotional system. So we could study emotions both as a precursor to a consumer phenomena or as an outcome of a consumer phenomena. Let me just mention some of the classic findings from some of the affect literature in consumer behavior. So here we've got something called the mood congruence effect. It basically says the mood that I'm in will lead me to better remember advertising information that is consistent with that mood. If I'm in a bad mood or sad mood, I'll remember advertisements that have sad moods in them. right? In other words, there's a match between my emotional state and the emotional signal that is being exuded by the message. So if it's congruent, I'm more likely to remember that. Then there's another very cool finding. It's called the mood state dependent effect. This basically says that the mood that I was in when I was trying to memorize something at encoding, when I was trying to learn something, if it is the same mood that I'm in when I'm then trying to recall the information, if there's a congruency between the mood states when I was trying to remember information and the mood state when I'm trying to, when I'm first learning the information and then when I'm trying to recall the information, if let's say I'm in a sad mood in both, that increases my chances of recalling information. If there's an incongruity, if I was in a sad mood when I was encoding, but then I'm in a happy mood when I was in retrieval, then that reduces my ability to learn information. So both of these are forms of, if you'd like, matching of moods from one state to another. And here's another very interesting finding. This basically says that, it's not just the size of how, for example, if I'm in a bad mood, let's say you have a neutral mood, and then I could move you towards negative mood by some epsilon. Well, the root of that epsilon might itself alter my behavior. So for example, if I'm, so you imagine that I'm at the neutral point. Usually here I would draw something on the board to make it easier to sort of explain to you what I'm trying to say, but I'll try to do it here only through audio. So if we are at a neutral point and then I move you towards the left, towards the negative continuum by some epsilon amount, well, now you are in a bad mood. But let's suppose you are in a bad mood because you're sad versus you are in a bad mood because you're anxious. Even though both sadness and anxiety might cause you to get to the same epsilon point on that continuum, the fact that the source of the negative mood is different, either due to sadness or anxiety, will completely alter your behavior as a consumer, which makes sense, right? So it's not just the size of how much of a good mood or bad mood I'm in, it's really also the root that's causing me to move to the left or the right. So for example, if I'm trying to see how consumers engage in risk-taking or not, how they engage in risk-taking will depend on whether they are in a sad mood or anxious mood. So for example, if they're in an anxious mood, you expect them to be more risk-aversive because then that's one of the ways that you reduce your anxiety. So again, the point here is that it's not just the size of how good of a mood or bad of a mood you're in, it's the cause of that mood that also impacts your behavior. I did a study many years ago looking at how affect affects our information search, our information processing. And I was very interested in specifically studying one emotional state called dysphoria. Dysphoria is the opposite of euphoria. It's a, if you'd like, a recurring state of blueness. So it's not just I'm pissed off today. It's, my life sucks. My pet passed away. My marriage is not nice. I hate my job. So it's not quite clinical depression, but it's much more than just a transient state of feeling bad today. And this is called dysphoria. And so what I wanted to study was, how does dysphoria affect people's behavior when they are making decisions? And I was interested in studying this because the literature was actually quite contradictory. Some people thought and found that dysphorics search for less information because they're apathetic. Who cares? Life sucks. I don't want to put in much effort. Other people had found that dysphorics search for more information, to the extent that dysphoria causes you to sort of be in a what's called a learned helplessness state, that one of the ways that I can regain control is by inputting more effort into some decision. And so every possible finding that you could think of, the literature had documented. And so I was hoping to do this very, very big study to try to sort of tease out what the actual effects were. And I think I had something like, I think if the number is right, I had 17 dependent measures, meaning I had compared dysphorics and non-dysphorics on something like 17 measures. And I had gotten on all but one. So let's, if the right number is 17, on 16 out of the 17 measures, I had gotten no difference between the two groups. In other words, dysphoria did not seem to affect people's approaches to making decisions. Now, I had submitted this to a top journal called Cognition and Emotion, which is exactly what this topic is. Cognition is how we make, how we make decisions as part of cognition. And emotion, of course, is exactly what I'm studying here, dysphoria. And the editor in question had gotten back to me and said, wow, great paper, very rigorous, very methodologically sound, wonderful. But hey, Dr. Sat, too bad that you seem to have only found null effects. What is a null effect? Null effect means no finding. Remember, if I think in 16 out of the 17 measures that I had collected, I found no differences. And from his perspective, oh, well, you can't report null findings. Now, that is a major problem in science because this is called the file drawer problem. If you don't find something, you just file it in your drawer and then nobody ever finds out that you did the study. Well, that's idiotic because in many cases, a null finding is an important finding. So the fact that I had found that dysphoria doesn't affect decision making was something that should be documented in the literature. If anything, it was a very robust finding since I had found for almost all the variables no differences between the two groups, but regrettably, the editor didn't see it this way. Well, till today, this is now close to 20 years ago, I still haven't published this paper. And so now people are not aware of this study. If somebody is doing a meta-analysis to look at what is the state of affairs in this field, they wouldn't even know that I have this study because I've never even published it yet. Now, how would you study all of these emotions from an evolutionary perspective? Well, of course, our emotional system didn't come out of thin air. It arises, via evolution. So you could study things like envy, anger, jealousy, schadenfreude. Anybody know what schadenfreude is? Can you think what it might be? Well, schadenfreude is the rejoicing at the mishaps or misfortunes of another. So imagine a guy whizzes by you in a fancy Ferrari on the highway, and then 5 kilometers down the line, you see him, no, not in an accident, let's not be this diabolical. You see him pulled over by the cops and he's gotten a huge ticket and his car is going to be towed because he was driving too fast. He was really violating the speed limit. Well, you might say to yourself, yes, bastard. I'll show you. Well, that emotion is schadenfreude. Shame, fear, disgust, all of these things are ultimately things that we can study, emotions that we can study from an evolutionary perspective. Let me just sort of mention one here. Envy. The things that women are envious about vis-a-vis other women and the things that men are envious about vis-a-vis other men is very much tied to an evolutionary calculus. Men usually don't walk around saying, oh, I hate John. He has such a nicer ass than mine. But they will say, oh, this bastard, he's a show-off because he's a higher social status guy. So the things that will trigger competitive, will trigger competitive envy in one sex need not be the same thing as that which triggers it in another sex. And so similar arguments can be made for each of these different emotions. I think we might have discussed already how men and women respond differently to emotional versus sexual infidelity, right? In other words, how jealous they become when you try to imagine your partner engaging in sexual versus emotional infidelity is different for men and women. So that's an example here of studying jealousy from an evolutionary perspective. The negativity bias basically says that positive information plus delta positive information or negative delta negative information doesn't carry the same impact to you. For a given piece of information that's either on the positive end or the negative end, the negative information will be attended to much more by your brain for obvious evolutionary reasons. So this gives you a sense of how we can study emotions and consumer behavior both from a non-evolutionary and an evolutionary perspective. Moving on to attitudes. How do we form an attitude? How do I decide that I love Mazda, that I love Concordia, that I dislike this type of electronic camera. Well, the earliest model of attitude formation was based on what's called the affective model. An attitude was simply a feeling. I love Coke. I hate, visiting Germany, right? So the original model of attitudes supposed that attitudes are really affective states, emotional states. But then, of course, that's not quite the right story, because later scholars argued that attitudes are really made up of three components: a cognitive component, an affective component, and a conative or behavioral. In other words, our attitudes are shaped by these three separate attitudinal systems. So cognitive would be rationalizations. So Concordia University has well-designed classrooms. This is why my attitude towards Concordia is positive. Concordia University has good student-faculty ratio. So these are cognitive justifications in support of why you hold a positive or negative attitude towards something, a product. Affective is what we said earlier. It's just an emotional state. I love Concordia. I'm proud to be at Concordia. And then the conative or behavioral is, for example, purchase intention. The next time that you need to enroll at a university for your graduate studies, how likely would you go to Concordia? How likely are you to recommend Concordia? So the idea is that our attitudinal positions are really shaped by each of these three separate components to attitudes. Of course, one would expect that they are consistent with each other. But interestingly, since we were talking about purchase intention data here, what I say I might do doesn't always correlate to what I actually do. The correlation between intended behavior and realized behavior is 0.3. So 0.3 is still statistically significant, but it's hardly a one-to-one mapping. It's not a correlation of 1. So when you're trying to, for example, estimate consumer demand, how likely are you to purchase a watch next year? Or political data, how likely are you to vote for this candidate? What people say is hardly a perfect depiction of what they end up doing. So many econometric models incorporate this discrepancy within their estimates. And here I simply wish to say that how quickly you share an attitude is a reflection of how strongly you hold that attitude. This is very similar to when I earlier mentioned the word association task. If I tell you Mercedes and I ask you, tell me the first thing that comes to mind, and you say power. Well, two people might both say power when first prompted with the word Mercedes, but one says it 0.3 seconds later, the other one says it 2.3 seconds later. Even though they said the same thing, the fact that they responded with different reaction times says something about how tightly they hold that association. The elaboration likelihood model is a model that is used to explain how people, how they're persuaded, if you like. Remember, when you're forming an attitude, if I'm forming an attitude as to whether I like Mazda or not, I'm being persuaded toward that attitude. So the elaboration likelihood model basically says that consumers engage either one of two routes to persuasion, either what's called the central route of persuasion or the peripheral route. Central route of persuasion is where a consumer is engaging in effortful cognitive thinking as they're being persuaded. So if I'm telling you, here are the 17 reasons why you should choose my mutual fund, well, that's going to probably engage the central route of persuasion. On the other hand, if I'm trying to convince you to buy a perfume, I don't usually tell you, here are the 17 physiological reasons according to Harvard physiologists as to why you should buy the perfume. What is the typical ad for a perfume? You see a woman, a beautiful woman with long flowing hair on a horse, and then you just hear mystère, right? Enigma, right? Now, why are you doing that? It's because you want to engage your peripheral senses. You're not trying to convince people through higher order cognitive thinking. You're just trying to engage their hedonic sense. And so depending on the type of products that you are trying to persuade people about will determine how you will presume to engage consumers, either via the central route or the peripheral route. Now, how would we study attitudes via an evolutionary lens? Well, look at this study, very cool study by Griskevicius et al. So there are many different ways by which we can try to persuade people, consumers. One common approach is what's called social proofing. Social proofing is when you tell consumers, hey, many other people have done it successfully and have enjoyed it. Shouldn't you too? So 6 billion people served, McDonald's. That's called social proofing. Scarcity appeal is limited edition, right? You are unique, you are different. This is a scarcity appeal, right? Be one of the few to own this rare gem, right? Well, both of these appeals work in different contexts. But what these researchers wanted to do was to see whether if we put you in one of two mindsets, whether we can change which of these two appeals you prefer. You follow? And the two primes were either I'm going to put you in a survival mindset, or I'm going to make you think about mating, about reproduction, about sex. So which one do you think fits with which one? Think about it for a second. Well, for survival, I don't want to stand out from the crowd, right? I mean, think about it. It's herd mentality. Think about when you have a school of fish trying to avoid a predator. They all move in unison, none of whom wants to stand out. So for survival, when I put consumers in a survival mindset, then they tend to prefer the social proofing appeal. When I put consumers in a mating mindset, then in a mating context, I want to stand out. I don't want you to think that I'm similar to everybody else. I want you to think that I'm unique, and therefore the scarcity appeal works better. So this shows you how the two advertising appeals, two persuasion appeals, will work differentially, so will be more or less effective depending on the mindset that the consumer is in when viewing these appeals. And in this case, you wouldn't have thought about all this were you not coming from an evolutionary lens. Here's another really cool study from Hayward and Rower. They basically asked people's attitudes, again, this is very much consumer behavior. Hey, what do you think about mandatory paternity testing at hospitals? Right, so think about it for a second. Well, now we're going to ask men what they think about that service, and we're going to think about what women would think about the service. Who do you think liked the idea better of mandatory paternity testing? Of course, if at this point you're starting to get evolutionary thinking, women said, yeah, not a great idea. Men were like, yeah, great idea. Why? Because paternity uncertainty is a fundamental driver of human realities. Men face paternity uncertainty. Women use paternity uncertainty to their advantage. So it's not surprising when it comes to this service, women were more attitudinally, unfavorable towards this product. Well, this sex difference in attitudes could not be explained via anything other than an evolutionary lens. Here, why do you think I put the Maury Povich show here? Well, any of you who might have had the misfortune of seeing this show, nearly every second episode is the exact same show with different characters. There's a woman who comes on the show. Her man accuses her of cheating on him. It's not my child. She says, yes, it is your child, Johnny. And then they have a paternity test to establish whether it is his child or that of his best friend. Well, why is it that every second show seems to be exactly that theme? Is it that the producers can't come up with any other clever ideas? No. What's the currency for television shows? It's ratings, because ratings determine how much I could charge advertisers to place ads on my show. Well, providing the viewing audience with evolutionary drama is something that appeals to our brain. And therefore, people choose the path of least resistance. So the reason why every second show is nothing but a big paternity DNA test is because that helps the ratings. There you go. Moving on to personality. How does personality affect consumer behavior, and how can we Darwinize it? Well, there are different theories about how personality is structured. The original position of personality theorists was that it's very non-malleable. Your personality is your personality is your personality. It is cast in stone and it is non-malleable. Then the exact opposite proposition was proposed by who are folks that are called radical situationists. They basically say, no, 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 there is no such thing as a fixed personality type. Everybody can be anything depending on the situation. I could be the staunchest extrovert or the staunchest introvert depending on the situation at hand. And of course, the right answer is really somewhere between these two. The reality is that there are fixed personality types. If this is a continuum, here's introverted, here's extroverted, I might be here on extroversion, you might be here, but then within my fixed point, I could go this way or that way depending on the situation at hand. So I am inherently an extroverted person, but if I go to a party with colleagues, many of whom I don't know, then I might put a restraint on my extroversion. Okay. Now here's a very, very interesting question. I wonder if we were in class, I would open this up for discussion, but we're not in class, so I'll probably just give you the answer right away. Why would evolution maintain heterogeneity in personality types? So for example, when you look at your fingers, unless you've got a congenital problem or a genetic problem, we're all born with 10 fingers. As a matter of fact, when you have a child, one of the first things that the nurse will do is count the number of fingers and toes that your child has. So it's not as though some are born with 10, some are born with 3. It's not a normal distribution. It's a fixed trait. Okay, evolution has fixed it now. We have 10 fingers. Why wouldn't evolution fixed, one personality type? Why don't we all have the same personality type? And the answer is because there isn't one optimal personality type for all, environments, social environments. In one environment, being extroverted might be truly optimal and beneficial. In another environment, being extroverted, is a death blow. You better be quiet. Okay. Well, this is exactly what happens in organizational cultures, right? Google has a very different organizational culture than, JP Morgan. And so when you typically go for an interview and they give you a personality test, it's not so much that they're trying to see whether, your personality is X, Y, Z, but it's rather to see whether your personality fits with their organizational culture. If there's a fit, then you are better in that sense than someone whose personality doesn't fit with this particular organizational culture. And so evolution would not have evolved one singular optimal personality type because no such personality type exists. And related to this point, this is a brilliant finding. This is not my finding, but one that animal comparative psychologists have come up with. If you look at the heterogeneity of personality types across species, the more social a species is, the greater the personality heterogeneity within that species. So let me give you a specific example. Within feline species, the cat family, the main animal, the main species that is social are lions. The other cats are solitary species. So based on this finding, we would expect lions to exhibit much greater personality heterogeneity than cheetahs. You follow? In other words, lions come in a broader range of personality types than do cheetahs. Now you might say, well, how the hell do you know that? Well, there are some very interesting studies that are done that seek to quantify the personality of a dog, of a cat, of whatever you want. That's exactly what comparative psychologists do, among many other things. If you're wondering how much of your personality is heritable, well, across personality traits is roughly 50%. So there's certainly a clear genetic component to your personality, but of course there's also an environmental component. What are some interesting personality traits of relevance to consumer behavior? Well, there's a million of these, but I just picked a few that I thought were cool. Well, what's dogmatism? Dogmatism is when someone is very non-malleable in their position. It's hard for you to move me from my position. It's hard for you to persuade me otherwise. I'm very dogmatic in my beliefs. So for example, this is why we call religious dogma, well, right? Because religion It's not as though if I give you evidence, you're likely to change the beliefs of your religion. It is what it is because it's a revealed truth. Therefore, it is dogma. Well, how you score on a scale of dogmatism affects many things you do as a consumer. For example, how likely you are to adopt new marketing approaches, adopt new products, how likely you are to counter argue advertisements. And so there are many things that you do as you navigate the world as a consumer that are very much linked to dogmatism. Sensation seeking is another very relevant personality trait in consumer behavior. How likely you are to engage in risky behavior, how you score on variety seeking, right? Do you like to buy the exact same soft drink each time, or do you want to try different soft drinks? Do you want to buy the same food when you go to the restaurant every time, or are you excited by novelty? Are you someone who is a variety seeker? Well, these behaviors and many others are very much related to how you score on sensation seeking. Locus of control is another great one. Locus of control is basically the idea that do you attribute things internally or externally? I did well on the exam because I'm smart. That's an internal attribution. Externally, I did poorly on the exam because Professor Sad is a bastard. So, and that's exactly what people do. They typically attribute successes internally and failures externally. Do you know what is the one group that doesn't do that? Clinically depressed people. And now, of course, this is a chicken and egg question because it basically begs the following. Is it that clinically depressed people started off by not having this attributional style, which then causes them to be more likely to be depressed? Or is it that once they become depressed, they suddenly become less rosy in their attributional styles? And the answer is, there is no answer yet. There's sort of mixed findings as to the chicken or egg question. But here's some stuff that's relevant to consumer behavior. For example, how likely you are to be a gambler is very much related to your locus of control score. All other things equal, if you are an external locus of control person, meaning that you attribute things to the environment, it's destiny, it's meant to be, it's written in the sky, then you're more likely to be a gambler. How you attribute product failures will be determined by whether you are an internal or external locus of control person. Need for cognition is another interesting trait. Need for cognition is basically, how much do you need actual cognitive effort before you commit to a decision? Well, not surprisingly, the higher you score on need for cognition, the more you search for information before you make a product choice. The higher your score on need for cognition, the more you prefer rational-based ads to emotional-based ads. So again, the amount of implications that we can, establish in linking personality traits to consumer behavior are truly limitless. Here's another one: maximizing versus satisficing. And here I wrote satisficing. It highlights it as if it's been misspelled, but it hasn't been misspelled. It's not. I didn't mean to write satisfying. To satisfy means to say it's good enough, right? So some of us are maximizers. We need to absolutely be sure. We have to maximize every last ounce of this decision, of this experience. Well, other people say, well, look, if it's good enough, I'll go with it. Well, not surprisingly, how you score on this scale determines how much information you search for. If you are a maximizer, you're more likely to search for information than if you are a satisficer. Machiavellianism is another great one. Machiavellianism refers to, if you like, your ability to manipulate in social settings, right? Remember, Machiavelli, the political philosopher, said it doesn't matter whether leaders are truly honest or not. What matters is that they can convince the electorate that they're honest. So it's consequentialist, basically. Can I get you to believe and persuade you of my intent? And of course, politicians are very good at this. If they are good politicians, they can convince you that they're empathetic, and that's why they hold babies when they are out on the electoral campaign, right? Look at me, I'm a protector, I'm empathetic, I'm kind, I'm gentle, right? Well, not surprisingly, the more Machiavellian you are, all other things equal, the lesser you score on ethics. Now, for those of you who are into sales, the more Machiavellian you are, the better your sales performance. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, that salespeople are unethical. It just means that salespeople have to have the Machiavellian intelligence to alter, for example, their sales pitch depending on the person that's standing in front of them, right? So it's not as though there is one sales pitch that I will equally apply across all people, but rather I have to have the Machiavellian intelligence to, in a sense, be a chameleon in my sales pitch. Okay, so it doesn't, Machiavellianism doesn't always mean, some sinister, evil, diabolical person. It just means that someone who is able to have strategic, manipulative intent. And of course, salespeople certainly, if they're good salespeople, are able to do that. Here's a really, really cool study that speaks to how we tend to choose products that are congruent with our perceived sense of self, right? So if I think that my personality is extroverted, risk taker, dangerous, then I will try to choose a product that has a similar personality to that which I think of myself. And it doesn't matter whether my self-perception of myself is accurate or not. It is what it is, right? So self-image congruence theory, basically congruence means you pick that which is most congruent with you. Now you might say, okay, well, how would one study such a thing? Well, look at this now. Look how clean and beautiful this is. So here is a bunch of items, antonyms, or semantically differential scales, rugged, delicate, exciting, calm. So let's suppose I give you, there are 4 cars, car A, B, C, D. For each of the cars, please fill out the personality of that car. So car A is Mazda. Well, is it rugged or delicate? Well, I don't know. It's maybe here somewhere. And I basically fill this whole thing out for car A, for car B, for car C, for car D. Then later, I ask the participant or the consumer to fill out this thing for themselves. What did they score? And then what do you think you ask them later? You go back to them and say, oh yeah, by the way, which of the 4 cars is your favorite? And what do you think happens? The car that is closest in terms of matching their personality is the one that they prefer. So a very beautiful and elegant way to show how we tend to prefer products that are most closely aligned with our self-image. Now here I'm talking about a form of matching, right? How you match your sense of self to the personality that is exuded by the, your preferred product. But there are other types of matching that are quite interesting. And I'm thinking, actually, I've been thinking for a few years to eventually write a paper on this. So here are some other forms of matching that I have found. Human assortative mating. Remember, we're talking about, matching in the mating market. The idea that we tend to, birds of a feather flock together, more so than opposites attract. And if you remember, there was one trait that I said is disassortative mating, meaning we tend to choose those who are different from us. And if you remember, which one was that? It was for MHC, major histocompatibility complex. Our immunological profiles, we tend to prefer people who are different from ours so that when we have children with that person, they could have maximal immunological defense. But for most traits, we tend to match in terms of birds of a feather flock together. People tend to match with their dogs. So the old adage of, you look like your dog turns out to actually be true. Now, how do you do these studies? You take a bunch of photos of people, you take a bunch of photos of their dogs, you kind of, shuffle them, and then you get people to try to match them. Which dog goes with which human? And incredibly, people are able to do that task at much higher than chance level. And similar studies have been done with matching cars to their owners. In other words, people are able to match person X with car Y. There you go. We're coming, I think, almost to the end. How much more we've got? About 4 slides. Now we move on to culture and consumer behavior. How can we study culture both from an evolutionary and non-evolutionary perspective? But I'll start you off with 2 really cute, humorous quotes. In Germany, everything is forbidden unless it's allowed. In Britain, everything is allowed unless it's forbidden. In France, everything is allowed even if it's forbidden. What's that basically saying is that different countries have different proclivities of, being sticklers about the rule. It reminds me of a story about one of my former colleagues from the economics department who at one point had gone on a visiting professorship, I think, to the University of Cologne. And she was crossing the street at one point at maybe 2 o'clock in the morning. There was not a single car in sight, but technically she was jaywalking, and so there was some German person from the balcony screaming at her because she was committing a legal violation. So in different countries, that same behavior would either be shunned or nobody would bat an eye. I mean, if you went to the Middle East and tried to stop people because they jaywalked, you're not going to survive very long. Here's another one. 4 men, a Saudi, a Russian, a North Korean, and a New Yorker are walking down the street. A marketing researcher says to them, "Excuse me, what is your opinion on the meat shortage?" The Saudi says, The Saudi says, "What's a shortage?" The Russian says, "What's meat?" The Korean says, "What's an opinion?" The New Yorker says, "Excuse me, what's excuse me?" Well, basically what that's saying is that a very simple question from a marketing researcher can cause different confusion depending on the cultural background of the person answering the question. Here's where you get into a lot of trouble in terms of international advertising, where you think that the connotations of symbols are universal. And so white doesn't mean the same thing across cultures. Neither does purple or blue or red or yellow flowers or white lilies or the number 7 or the number 13 for that matter, right? In the West, number 13 is bad luck. In other cultures, it's not. The triangle means negative in Hong Kong, Korea, and Taiwan. It's positive in Colombia. The owl is wisdom in the United States. It's bad luck in India. The deer is speed and grace in the US. It's homosexuality in Brazil. So if you take what's called semiotics, right, the understanding of symbols, if you take symbols and presume that they are universal and therefore use them globally for an advertising campaign, this is where you're going to get into trouble. Just to give you a sense of the richness of the human tapestry, again, we talk about the global consumer, there are approximately 10,000 cultures. There are several academic databases where researchers have tried to collect data, unimaginably detailed data on as many cultures as they could. So there's the Human Relations Area Files, which covers roughly 350 cultures that was started at Yale University. There's the Standard Cross-Cultural Sample, which covers slightly less than 200 cultures, 186 cultures. So if you wanted to know, for example, whether parenting styles are the same across cultures, well, you could go to one of these databases and they will probably have that variable coded for you. So this is an example where you could use secondary data in your projects if it would necessitate that. There are roughly 7,000 active languages, nearly half of which are in danger of becoming extinct. Example of extinct languages, Latin and Sanskrit. Now, I don't know if this number has changed. I haven't checked in a while, but I think it was until recently 193 United Nations members. This is actually an underestimate. There are way more than 10,000 religions. And here what I mean by religions, Christianity wouldn't just be coded as one religion, right? Seventh-day Adventist and Lutheran would be two different languages. Shia and Sunni Islam would be two different religions. So there are over 10,000 different religions in the world. Richard Dawkins famously made the following point. He goes, the difference between... Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist and a public intellectual who's very critical of religion. He said that the difference between a very religious person and an atheist is actually very little. So if we take this 10,000 number, the very religious person is an atheist on 9,999 religions, but is a very strong believer on one religion, whereas the atheist is a non-believer on 10,000 religions. So the difference between an atheist and a very religious person is that one is an atheist on 9,999 gods, whereas the other one is an atheist on 10,000 gods. A pretty interesting and astute observation. So one can easily imagine how much cultural diversity might have how it might have an impact on consumption, the clothes that we wear, the foods that we eat, the manner by which we engage different products. Culture leaves an indelible mark on much of our consummatory nature. But again, a lot of our cultural traditions exist in their form because of biology. Here's an important distinction to make here, the difference between what's called cultural relativism and human universals. As you know by now in this course, there is such a thing as a human universal. There are things that make the Peruvian and Japanese and Nigerian consumer very similar to each other because they share a biological heritage. Well, cultural relativists say, no, 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 there's no such thing as a human universal. Every culture has to be judged on its own merits. Well, that's baloney. There are things that transcend cultures. Okay, if you want to, study a list of human universals that have been documented, excellent book by Donald Brown, an anthropologist who in 1991 wrote a book exactly cataloging many, many universals. E.O. Wilson famously said the genes hold culture on the leash. The leash is very long, but inevitably values will be constrained in accordance with their effects on the human gene pool. That means, yes, of course, culture matters, but cultural forms don't exist in an infinite variety of ways. Cultural forms are still bound to biological limits, if you'd like. And here I simply wrote, beware of the weird bias. Weird refers to Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic samples. A lot of research in the behavioral sciences, and certainly in consumer behavior, starts off with some undergrads at Ohio State University, and then you presume that that translates to all of humanity. Well, for some phenomena, that might be true, but for other phenomena, if you truly want to argue that something is a universal, you actually have to go outside of your weird samples. You have to go to hunter-gatherer societies in Central Africa and in the Amazon to see whether they respond to facial features the same way that we do. And so the weird bias basically refers to the proclivity of a lot of researchers to succumb to the convenience effect, or convenience sampling. Well, I want to do a study, and therefore I'll use conveniently my undergraduate samples here at my university. And so in many cases, we have to be weary of that. So there you have it. This puts an end to the lecture of week 3, and I will shortly work on posting the lectures of weeks 4 and 5. Cheers, everybody.